listeners, and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast. Bring you energy matters in an informal setting. In our second pod after the summer break, we also turned to announcements made while we were off air. The German government approved a hydrogen import strategy in July, with the key takeaways being diversified supply, for instance from northern European countries as well as North Africa, and a forecast need for up to 130 terawatt-hours of hydrogen, ammonia and methanol by 2030. This represents almost a quarter of current German power use, so it's a very ambitious plan indeed. And set against the current rift in the government over the debt brake, with several ministries fighting over every Pfennig, or should I say Eurocent, is Germany setting out targets it doesn't stand a chance of meeting. So helping me to discuss this and much, much more is our old friend Henning Gloystein of Eurasia. A warm welcome to you, Henning.
Thank you. Great to be back with you.
Excellent. So what's the situation in Germany at the moment? How would you evaluate it? The sort of issues around the debt brake. It's a bit toing and froing. Where it's agreed and then it's not agreed. Where are we now?
Yeah, so basically they have agreed to not publicly disagree too much at the moment, which means that they quietly disagree about virtually everything in the budget, but they have agreed not to let the government coalition break over this. And I know that sounds really weird and bit basically incompetent, but the background here is that the Free Democrats have totally different views to the Social Democrats and the Green Party on how to finance the budget, on whether they should be able to allowed to take on more debt or not, whether they could try and bring this past to get constitutional change, which they would require. And for that, you need a 2/3 majority in the Bundestag, which they don't have. And basically, all I'm saying is that there's a lot of hurdles and loops to get over and through. And they have decided that they will muddle through until the general elections. And that is what they will manage, I think. And that means that they will agree little things and nothing too big.
So what does that mean for the funding for renewables then? And they were supposed to take from this COVID fund to finance the decarbonisation projects, but obviously that's off the table now. So where's the money for this very ambitious hydrogen strategy, for example, going to come from?
So there's less money available for the very ambitious hydrogen strategy. So the very ambitious hydrogen strategy is now a little bit less ambitious. That's the Sondervermögen, these special funds from COVID. They're just not there anymore. And they can fiddle with the figures a little bit by taking a little bit from another pot and put it into this one. And that's sort of some of the loops they're jumping through. And that gets you off the ground, but it won't get you towards the ambitions. And this is where I think the crux is, specifically to the hydrogen ambitions in Germany. They have got some off the ground. They're changing the way they're subsidizing the energy transition. So they're not going to give away these 20-year-long feed-in tariffs for renewable energy anymore, but instead will only incentivize building new capacity. And instead, they will hand out long-term contracts for difference, these Klimaschutzverträge, for decarbonization of industry, which includes a lot of hydrogen. But they've sort of the cars started, but they're not going to get to the high speed that they're planning to with the current budget, and the budget's not going to improve. So I think the hydrogen strategy will not be achieved. They'll get somewhere, but it won't be fully achieved.
Not by 2030.
No
at
way.
any rate.
No.
But I think it's an important point as well. You mentioned there, Henning, that the government is not going to collapse over this. So they've agreed that they're not going to kind of disband over this issue.
Yeah, that's actually so. Dare I say, I think that's a success for the government, because under slightly more or slightly different circumstances, this government would have collapsed long ago. First, maybe even during the energy crisis of 22, 23. Then again now over this constitutional crisis on debt, because they've got such different views. But there is the one thing, so the binding factor in this coalition of the sort of this forced coalition almost, is that the Free Democrats, so the most junior partner, the smallest partner in the coalition, if they were to just pull the plug now and say, that's it, we're out of this, and there was elections coming up soon, they would be at very high risk of falling below the 5% threshold, i.e. being out of parliament. So they would be close to committing suicide over this. Olaf Scholz, the chancellor, his party, the Social Democrats, would not collapse, but they would be at risk of falling below 20% maybe. And so he would certainly not be chancellor anymore. And the Social Democrats would be at their smallest ever since the post-war era. And then the Green Party, which just 4 years ago was hoping that they were contesting for becoming chancellor, but even Habeck, who was one of the more popular politicians, he probably wouldn't win the elections again and would be forced into some weird coalition that they didn't want. So none of the parties want the government to collapse at this stage, and that's why it isn't.
Okay. And what's the position of the CDU here in opposition? Would they support increased funds for these kind of projects?
No, that's the thing. So the CDU is the party that took this whole Sondervermögen stuff to the Supreme Court, to the Bundesverfassungsgericht, and Supreme Court in Germany said the conservatives were right. So Friedrich Merz, the head of the CDU, is looking smug at the moment and is saying, "I told you so," and he's just looking at the coalition saying, "Here, look, what a bunch of incompetent idiots," basically. And so he's watching this break. He is favourite to win the federal elections next year. I mean, it's a long time to go. A lot of things can change, but I think he's just biding his time and then see what happens in September next year when the elections take place.
I'd like to bring the discussion back to hydrogen, or green hydrogen in particular. I mean, you mentioned that the government has started the car, but it's sort of spluttering along in maybe first, maybe even second gear at the moment, and certainly is unlikely to hit these very ambitious targets by 2030. Beyond that's another question, but I'd just like to talk to you about green hydrogen. What's your view here? Is this really the key to unlocking the energy transition, as many will say, or is it kind of an expensive side trick or a diversion?
I think it's between those two. It's not the key to the energy transition, but it's a key. And I actually think you need pretty much every key available, and there's about 15 locks to the energy transition. Green hydrogen definitely plays a role. I mean, we've discussed this a little bit before on sort of where is green hydrogen feasible and how much is needed. More is needed than is feasible in Germany. This is why the German government has announced that they will import hydrogen or ammonia, which is a derivative product, also from third parties, because there's an awareness of this. They have, especially the Green Party, has now tolerates the fact that some of this hydrogen might not be green, it might be blue, so decarbonized the fossil gas, basically. Even that will struggle, though, but it's still needed because the green transition is now focusing more on decarbonization of heavy industry because, as I said earlier, these feed-in tariffs for renewable energy are going away because wind and solar is basically competitive at merchant terms now, whereas heavy industry decarbonization isn't. So that's where government support is there needed, and we need a clean form of gas in heavy, whether it's chemicals, whether it's steel making, cement making, all sorts of stuff. And hydrogen plays a role here. The preference is for domestic EU produced, maybe Norway produced because it's common market, green hydrogen. That is the priority because the EU's and Germany's overall goal is to electrify as much as possible. That's the decarbonization strategy. And that also means by taking out fossil gases out of the system. And green hydrogen is origin electric generation. So we want electric heating, electrically generated hydrogen, electric vehicles, and so forth. But there's a realization that part of this will not work because we can't build that much green hydrogen capacity. And that is where the CCS law in Germany is now coming in as well. Until basically this year, you couldn't even plan anything in CCS for Germany because you weren't allowed to store CO2 in Germany and you weren't allowed to export it as a waste product. So you couldn't do anything. Now they're changing that, and that will enable investment in this space. But it'll all be slow and it'll all be not quite as big as its biggest enthusiasts hope for. That's why I think the 2030 target is unrealistic. But I do think it will be an important fuel for heavy industry in particular in Europe and in Germany.
And you mentioned some industries in particular. I mean, we've seen projects in northern Sweden, for example, or northern Scandinavia, looking at greening the production of steel. It has to also be said that no green steel has yet been produced, but it's coming, you think?
It's definitely coming. So we're actually quite involved in this. So I can't give all the details, but there's dozens of projects now that are underway and that will produce green steel from about 2026. The first rebar clean steel products will come. The first electric vehicles will be made from green steel. There's the contracts are signed. But actually, I mean, you mentioned the Swedish stuff. I mean, the FT was reporting this week that green industry boom in Sweden is quite slow. It's the same problem. The ambition is there, the money is there, the know-how is there, but it's all taking longer than everybody wanted to. And it'll be like that in Germany. I suspect it might be even a bit slower in Germany because Germany tends to be fairly slow in these things. But it'll happen. And so the steel is a good example. Europe actually has a leading position in this globally. I think Europe will, by around 2030, 2035, be the first major steel producing region that churns out significant volume of clean steel.
But I think, isn't there a case for saying, okay, let's start with fossil hydrogen, or, the hydrogen that's produced from fossil fuels, so black or blue even. And then if you decarbonize that, you're making quite some headway into decarbonising key industries, right? Like fertilizer as well.
Yeah, we need to do both. So we need to pretty much try and get into from second to third, fourth, fifth gear, whatever, green and blue hydrogen, clean hydrogen, whatever, low carbon hydrogen, whatever you want to call it. We need it all. Grid hydrogen. As long as the electricity grid is clean, we need the grid to be able to provide electricity for hydrogen. So you can't just have what most countries now, this regulation that the unit of hydrogen must be connected to a specific power unit. Let's say offshore wind park A has to be connected to electrolysis unit B. If the grid is green enough, the UK is close to it, Sweden, probably France because of nuclear, then you should be able to just connect to the grid. And that's not there. And you mentioned blue hydrogen from natural gas. The CCS success story isn't there yet. So the oil and gas industry has been really not very good at showing the world that CCS is scalable and affordable. So I actually think, yes, the green hydrogen has big challenges ahead in terms of cost and deployment and scale. The gas industry in decarbonizing its own systems has, I'd say, an even bigger task to prove that it actually works at an affordable scale. And they're not there yet.
Exactly. And is blue hydrogen that palatable? That's hydrogen produced from gas. I mean, in Germany, that's obviously a difficult question.
Yeah, it's low on the priority list. But so this is the big change where the Green Party sort of dropped some of its previous dogma that they will say, okay, I mean, Minister Habeck keeps saying that they are colorblind now towards and technology neutral towards hydrogen as long as it's clean. But the unspoken truth is that subsidy support and policy support, regulatory support, still favors green hydrogen domestically produced over blue hydrogen imported, which I have some sympathy for. I mean, one, you're adding costs to an already costly import, and the other one, you are helping a domestic industry to be built. I prefer the latter.
Absolutely. And if we can go into some of the detail from the strategy that was announced by the German government, which countries were named in terms of where the imports could come from? And I mentioned Northern Europe, so there's maybe Norway, Denmark, UK even, and other countries on the list?
Norway is top of the list here. I mean, the Norwegian-German hydrogen strategy that was launched was in late 22 or early 2023 is the blueprint, and it's the most obvious one. The pipeline system's there, the common market is there. It's already Norway is the biggest supplier of energy to Germany. Both countries are rich; they get on well, so they can throw money at each other to build a future supply chain on this. North Africa plays a role. There's been some countries that are put on the list here. So Morocco plays probably a role because they're kind of emerging as North Africa's sort of hydrogen ammonia superstar. The UAE, Emirates, I think will play a very strong role. The UAE and Germany have fairly quietly started a quite deep strategic relationship over the last three years or so, and it's accelerated through the energy crisis. You have related ADNOC, so Abu Dhabi National Oil Corp, trying to buy Covestro, a German chemical company. That would open up decarbonization support for chemical industry for ADNOC in Germany, because the German government won't subsidize decarbonized fossil fuel production at source in the Emirates. So you have a backdoor there. The UAE supplied the first demonstration hydrogen shipment to Germany a year and a bit ago. So there's stuff going on there. Canada, I think, might play a role at some point, but Canada has its own domestic logistical issues that the East Coast doesn't really export that sort of stuff. The United States, depending on the outcome of the presidential election, would be a very strong play here. And then, I mean, there's also talks in South America, in Southern Africa, even as far away as Australia. But that, I think, is just political intention being outspoken. The shipping from Western Australia to Europe makes no sense at all. Even South America, I find a little bit of a stretch. So I think with ammonia and hydrogen imports for Germany, you basically have to look at periphery. And as far as you can get is maybe North America and maybe at some point Eastern Europe. Ukraine maybe even, but the Nordics, I mean, Finland talks about this quite a lot now as well. So it's sort of the periphery if you couple of thousand kilometers circle around Germany, I think that's what the most feasible is.
Sure. I mean, we're talking, as you mentioned, the derivative products of hydrogen more than actually the gas itself in terms of the transportation.
Yes. So liquid ammonia is currently sort of on a favorite version of it because the shipping is easier. The production at site in places like the Middle East or Northern Africa is quite easy. You do have some storage problems on the receiving side here, though, because liquid ammonia really is explosive. I mean, that I think is a security issue. But for heavy industry, I think that works because, I mean, the chemical sector is very used to handling toxic and dangerous materials. But this is also where, for instance, hydrogen in heating, I think, is a bit far-fetched in household heating. Even if it can be made safe, which it probably can be, but I think people just don't want that. They just have an image of the Hindenburg blowing up, and
very much so, and these sort of very hazardous chemicals that we're talking about here, Henning. But you mentioned also the pipeline. So coming from Norway, now I've heard a lot of talk about the gas, both the transmission grid or the transportation grid, and the lower kind of distribution level. Is it feasible that you can transport hydrogen in these pipelines without making huge investments in order to coin a phrase, make them hydrogen ready?
Yeah, that's like the future power stations, the gas-fired power stations that will be made hydrogen ready at some point in the future. I think that's politics kicking the can down the road, literally. They're saying like, okay, we've put the intention into the law, and a future government and regulator must, an engineer will figure out how exactly we make them hydrogen ready. Intentions there, there'll probably be subsidies there, and hopefully technological advances over the next decade to actually make it happen. At this stage, I think that's not fully realistic. The turbines can be made hydrogen ready. I've talked to turbine makers who say, yeah, we can do that. They're more expensive, but we can do it. The pipeline operators can do the same thing. I mean, the pioneers are probably here, the Netherlands. They've got this Highway 27 project from the government to make the entire Dutch gas grid hydrogen ready. And they're on track. And Germany has a really good accidental advantage here that the northern German gas grid is owned by the Dutch gas grid operator, Gasunie. So they're kind of they're benefiting from Dutch innovation here. So I'd actually look at the Netherlands and the hydrogen cluster around Rotterdam, maybe also Belgium, Antwerp, the Waterstofnet that they've got going there. That's, as far as I'm aware, where at least in Europe the biggest innovation is happening in this space. And then areas like Wilhelmshaven, Hamburg, whatever, they can probably feed off that. And there's a lot of cooperation between the two. So I'm cautiously optimistic that it'll work at some stage, but at the moment it's a good intention rather than a fixed plan.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about this privately, Henning, as well, and you've made a very good case for the use of hydrogen and hydrogen derivative products in industry, but to generate, to transport and burn green hydrogen as a fuel for the power industry just, for me, doesn't seem to make much sense. And there's a lot of talk, as you mentioned, this kind of idea of a hydrogen-ready gas plant. I don't know. The finances, the science, everything just seems to say this would be an extremely inefficient use of that technology.
I think you might be right. So I don't know this, but I have a sneaking suspicion that these 10 gigawatts of hydrogen-ready gas-fired power stations that the Germans are building, step one, build the gas-fired power stations so that they replace coal. And then that's part of the decarbonisation strategy, and it enables the coal phase out, not by 2030. The Germans will fail on that as well, I'm pretty sure, but by 2038, as the law at least says. So in the 2030s, they'll manage. It will provide that. Then you can still offset a little bit. You can maybe get some heavily decarbonized gas from Norway, from North America, into those power stations that decarbonizes again. And then maybe by the mid-late 2030s, you don't really need the hydrogen in them at all. I think that's what's going to happen, but it's early stages. I mean, I hope I'm wrong. Actually, no, maybe I don't even hope I'm wrong. I just don't. I think you're right. It's pure hydrogen-fired gas power stations isn't very efficient, is it?
No, not really. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. But I think there are a couple of issues here. Firstly, you have, okay, we built this hydrogen-ready gas-fired plant, but there's no hydrogen, so let's just burn gas. That's the one thing. And then the second part is that would then imply that you're locking yourself into a gas future, into a fossil fuel future for however 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah, as long as it's not past 2050 or 2045, I think you can use 10 gigawatts isn't huge. And then you can talk to your suppliers and say, hey, can you decarbonize some of that gas, please? That would be really good. And so I think that's sort of the backdoor exit here. And then maybe not operate these gas-fired power stations for 40 years. You just replace them with storage units, imports, whatever. I don't know whatever it becomes available later.
And I think there's an added issue here as well. And I think it's because hydrogen is, pardon the pun, a very hot topic at the moment. It's very easy to make announcements. It's to say we're building this here. We've got these plants. We've got this infrastructure, this electrolyzer here. Doesn't seem to be so easy to say, actually, no, we're spiking this. And there are very few, from what I read and from what the journalists are finding here, that of projects that come to fruition at the moment. Maybe I'm being a bit pessimistic here, but I think there's a lot of noise around it, but very little of actual, happening on the ground. I don't know what you're feeling. Maybe I'm being too cynical here, Henning.
No, it's true. I mean, at the moment it's tiny, but I do think we are approaching a kickoff point. So what I mentioned earlier in the clean steel sector, that will kick off, barring a major screw up. By 2026, you will see the first clean steel, and you will not huge, but it's more than anywhere else in the world. And then by 2030, you will have quite a lot going on. Public clean steel tracker where you can see how much is coming up, and it's quite a bit. And so I think that, and then people see, oh, goodness me, it works. And then I think you will start seeing the first chemical plants that really do feed green hydrogen into their units. And once that happens, they will make a big PR splash about this. They will say, hey, look at that. We have a stake in this great offshore wind park, and it produces very competitive electricity, and we're using it directly to feed our units here. I mean, it's public stuff. So BASF, they bought 25% in this Dutch offshore wind park. They have an electrolysis deal with the local authorities in the Waterstofnet in Antwerp, and it's German subsidies. The Antwerp Declaration that was launched in February this year, this big industrial competitiveness call, sort of industry call on politicians, I think will be taken up. I think it's gathered a lot of momentum now that the European Parliament's going to come back in, new commission. They will take that up. And so I think between 2025 and 2027, we're going to see quite a lot of stuff coming on. And I think that will then lead to a bit more, I mean, I'm not a PR guy, but positive publicity saying like, oh, look, it's there and it's doing stuff. But you're right, we're not quite there yet. At the moment, there's a lot of PowerPoint and less actual engineering.
Absolutely. And I think once we get to the stage, and fingers crossed we do, that we see these inroads made into the decarbonising European industry, that there will be a domino effect in others. So if we can do it in steel, why not chemicals? Why not glass? Why not others? I think...
Cement.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But is there another point here that... would you say Germany is a front runner here in terms of its hydrogen strategy and what it wants to do? And that there's a case for other countries looking very closely, saying, oh, well, we'll let Germany make a few mistakes and then we'll come and do it differently or in the same way, maybe.
Yes, I think that's correct, because Germany is a little bit of a front runner. They're not totally ahead in the pack of hydrogen developing, clean hydrogen, green hydrogen developing countries. As I often say to clients who are in public, the Netherlands and Belgium are ahead in this. But Germany, of the major European or maybe major even global economies, is one of the ones. And because the scaling there is so big, the government support is so big, the industry demand is so big, it's definitely the case that a lot of other countries look very closely at what Germany is doing with these climate CFDs, so the Klimaschutzvertrag, the way the subsidies work, how industry adopts it, where there's screw-ups, mistakes. Yes. So I think a lot of countries are looking at what's going on in Germany, and then they will pick and choose what worked best. Germany's done this before in its Energiewende when they first launched it 30 years ago. There was also a lot of mistakes in that one, but yeah, that's. I mean, when you have a big industry that employs so many people like in Germany, you have to move a little bit faster than others. And then on top of that, you have the energy crisis of the last 2.5 years. They really had to move fast. So I don't think Germany is in a position to say, like, let's wait until Italy or Japan does something, or Britain. They kind of have to do it themselves.
Rightly, pointing out the major successes with the energy transition, the massive growth in renewables in Germany, as well as dealing with the energy crisis. Let's not forget, they were major breakthroughs, and without which I think Europe would be in a very different place. But I think on the other side, if Germany fails in this green hydrogen project, then I think Europe and European industry fails as well, or is put in a very tight spot.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm greatly opposed to this often implored deindustrialization of Germany or parts of Europe because of high energy prices and the failing green transition. I think it's really not true, and I think it will really not be true. And I really believe there will be a green industrial dividend coming our way at some point towards the end of this decade, probably, hopefully. But you're absolutely right. If they screw this up, if it doesn't work, then I think Europe does face major problems in keeping its industry alive here, because that would mean that it's not just they'll have failed to clean it up, and they will have failed to make it more competitive again by enabling cheaper energy costs to industries. So if they fail on those both accounts, then that would be pretty nasty.
So that would be a disaster. But let's try and stay optimistic here, Henning. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Excellent to gain your insights here, Henning. And I'm sure this is a topic we'll return to maybe further, 6 months, 12 months down the line, and see how far the German government has got, if political constellations await Germany in the future. So, Henning, thank you very much for being a guest on the Montel Weekly Podcast.
Thank you very much.